Draugr. Most undead creatures in world mythology are described as diminished versions of what they were in life: pale, slow, confused, desperate. The Draugr is the opposite. In Norse sagas, the Draugr is a physically undead revenant that retains a corporeal body, often described as swollen, blue-black, and unnaturally large, with superhuman strength that exceeds anything it possessed while alive. It doesn't wander aimlessly. It guards. It pursues. It has goals. Norse sources distinguish two main types: the Haugbui, mound dwellers who stayed bound to their burial barrows and attacked anyone who disturbed their grave goods, and the Optergangr, literally again walkers, who actively left their graves to return to their former homes, kill livestock, drive people mad, and settle scores with anyone they'd held grudges against in life. Similar web. The word Optergangr is worth sitting with for a moment. Again walker. Not revenant, not undead, not ghost. Simply someone who walks again. The Norse treated it as a category of person rather than a category of monster. The Draugr legends are deeply rooted in Viking burial practices. The Norse believed that improper burial or a violent death could produce a Draugr, which meant that burial rites were not just ceremony, they were containment. Defeating a Draugr required a specific procedure documented across multiple sagas: wrestling it back into its grave, decapitating it, burning the body, and scattering the ashes at sea, each step necessary because any one alone was insufficient. The Draugr had been killed once already. It knew how that went. Skyrim has sold over 30 million copies. The Draugr are in it. They are among its most recognizable enemies. That is not a coincidence. It is a 1,300-year-old creature finding a new medium, which is itself a form of coming back. Jiangshi. Here is the thing most people get wrong about the Jiangshi. It doesn't hop because it's supernatural. It hops because it's dead. The Jiangshi is stiffened by rigor mortis, the natural hardening of muscle tissue after death, making it unable to bend its limbs, which results in the creature being forced to move with arms outstretched, lurching forward in rigid, rhythmic jumps. The name itself, Jiangshi, means stiff corpse. The horror was named after a biological process. The most historically documented origin of the Jiangshi legend involves actual labor migration in Qing dynasty China. Workers who died far from home needed to be returned to their ancestral villages for burial, the belief being that a soul buried far from family would grow homesick. Families too poor to pay transportation hired Taoist priests to conduct a practice called transporting a corpse over 1,000 li. The priests traveled at night by secondary roads, carrying lanterns and ringing bells to warn off passers-by, because it was considered bad luck to see a Jiangshi. The corpse movers placed bamboo poles under the arms of the deceased. One carrier in front, one in back, the poles on their shoulders. When they walked, the flexing of the poles made the corpse appear to bob and hop in rhythm with their steps. Someone saw this procession in the dark, a line of bodies moving at night on a road that should have been empty, and told someone else what they saw. The Jiangshi legend spread from there. The Jiangshi cannot see. It detects victims by the sound of their breathing. The folklore advice for surviving an encounter is straightforward: hold your breath. Thousands of years of elaborate mythology, and the solution is just be very quiet. Strigoi. Dracula is Romanian. The Strigoi is what Romania actually believed in before Bram Stoker arrived. The Strigoi comes in two forms: Strigoi 7, living Strigoi, and Strigoi morts, dead ones. Living Strigoi are humans with the potential to become undead after death. People born as the 7th consecutive child of the same sex, born with a caul over their face, or born outside marriage. They were marked at birth for what they would become. They lived ordinary lives. They just had a different ending scheduled. YouTube Romanian folklore preserves one of the most elaborate undead belief systems in Europe. The Strigoi is not simply a vampire story, but part of a complex culture of death ritual and spiritual protection. Revenant fears across Eastern Europe were deeply tied to communal anxieties about death, illness, and improper burial. The Strigoi's preferred victims were not strangers, they were family. Specifically, the Strigoi returned to drain the life of its closest relatives first, which is simultaneously more horrifying and more logical than targeting the general population. It went where it knew the doors, where it knew the faces, where it would be recognized and, for a critical moment, perhaps trusted. The first historically documented individual described as a Strigoi was Jure Grando Alilovic, a villager from Istria who died in 1656 and was recorded in contemporary local documents as terrorizing his former village for 16 years after his death. He was eventually decapitated by the local priest. 16 years. The village endured 16 years of this before someone decapitated him. That detail does not appear in Bram Stoker's version. Most undead in world mythology are trapped in their own dead bodies. They have one body and they're stuck with it. The Vetala has a different arrangement entirely. In Hindu mythology, the Vetala is a spirit that occupies other people's corpses, sliding in and out of dead bodies at will, using them as vehicles and abandoning them whenever it finds a better option or simply loses interest. The Vetala haunts charnel grounds, possesses and leaves dead bodies at will, and is described in Sanskrit texts as a knowledgeable entity capable of fortune-telling. Bradhaworth. The most famous Vetala appears in the Baital Pachizi, a Sanskrit text from roughly the 11th century, in which the legendary king Vikramaditya is tasked with capturing a Vetala that hangs upside down from a tree in a cremation ground. Every time Vikramaditya captures it and carries it toward his destination, the Vetala tells him a story. The story ends with a riddle. If the king answers the riddle, the Vetala immediately flies back to its tree. The Vetala knows Vikramaditya cannot stay silent when he knows the correct answer. It has correctly identified the specific weakness of a man considered the wisest king of his age, the inability to pretend ignorance, and built an escape mechanism around it. The king carries a creature that understands him better than he understands himself toward a destination he never quite reaches. This has been described as a frame narrative structure in ancient Indian literature. It is also just a very elegant trap. Nachzehrer. Bavaria, 17th century. A plague moves through a village and kills a third of the population in 6 weeks. The survivors begin dying too, one by one. Not from the plague, but from a wasting illness with no clear cause. Slow, progressive, definitive. The village concludes that someone in the cemetery is eating them. The Nachzehrer, after Devourer, is a German and Bavarian undead creature that kills not by rising and attacking, but by lying in its grave and consuming. The Nachzehrer feeds first on its own funeral shroud, then on its own flesh, and through this self-consumption it drains the life force of its living relatives above ground. It also feeds on other corpses nearby. The mechanism required no movement, no confrontation, no leaving the grave. The damage happened through a connection between the dead and the living that nobody could see or interrupt, because nobody knew where to look. You could identify a Nachzehrer in its grave by a specific posture. Thumb of one hand held in the closed fist of the other, left eye open. Investigators exhuming suspected Nachzehrer graves during plague years reported finding bodies that appeared freshly nourished, plump, flushed, full of blood, while the bodies around them had decayed normally. This was taken as confirmation. The modern explanation involves differential rates of decomposition based on soil conditions, body composition, and bacterial activity. Bodies in certain soils can appear extraordinarily preserved, while surrounding bodies do not. The 17th century did not have that explanation. They had a creature that made sense of the pattern, and the pattern was real enough. Revenant. Medieval France had a word for the dead who came back, and it was specific enough to be useful. A revenant, from the French revenir, to return, was documented with enough consistency across 12th and 13th century France that the theologian William of Newburgh dedicated significant portions of his chronicle, Historia Rerum Anglicarum, written around 1198, to cataloging and analyzing their appearances. He treated them as a genuine social problem requiring investigation and response. The typical revenant was not a stranger. It was a neighbor, a husband, a former guild member, someone the community had buried and believed resolved. What brought them back was almost always the same: a wrong that had not been addressed, a debt unpaid, a murder unavenged, a dying confession that nobody had acted on. William of Newburgh's account described communities responding to revenant appearances the way they would respond to any civic emergency: with urgency, with designated authority figures, and with a formal procedure. A bishop was consulted, absolution was granted in writing and placed in the coffin. The revenant stopped appearing. The church's solution to an undead corpse was paperwork, which is, if you think about it, not entirely different from how institutions still try to resolve the unresolved dead: inquests, commissions, official acknowledgments, formal apologies. The specific technology has changed. The underlying logic is identical. Leyak. The Leyak is Balinese, and it comes back from the dead because it was never entirely alive in the way most people are. During daylight, a Leyak is a person. A specific person, a neighbor, a healer, a priest, living a normal life in the village. At night, the head detaches from the body, organs trailing beneath it, and floats through the dark to consume the life force of sleeping victims. By morning, it has reattached and resumed its ordinary existence. What makes the Leyak theologically precise in the Balinese tradition is the direction of the transformation. Balinese spiritual practice holds that both healing and black magic draw from the same body of knowledge. The texts that teach medicine contain the same information that, pursued past a certain threshold in the wrong direction, lead to becoming a Leyak. There is no separate dark tradition. There is one tradition, and you can walk it one way or the other. The Leyak is therefore not someone who was corrupted from outside. It is someone who kept going when they should have stopped, who decided that the knowledge was more important than the constraint on the knowledge. Bali still maintains practitioners called Balian, who identify and counter Leyak activity. This is not archived folklore. Consultations still happen. The tradition is current. Every profession produces people who go too far. Bali just has a specific name for what they become when they do: Gashadokuro. The Gashadokuro does not come back from one death. It comes back from thousands. When mass catastrophe, war, famine, plague, kills large numbers of people who are then left unburied and unmourned, their concentrated onryo coalesces into a single entity. A skeleton 15 meters tall, eye sockets burning, teeth clattering together in the dark. Gachi gachi, the only warning of its approach. It cannot be killed. It has already been killed, thousands of times over, in thousands of separate bodies. There is no remaining vulnerability to target. It will exhaust its own energy across decades, and nothing accelerates that process. The most historically significant Gashadokuro legend connects to the 940 CE Taira no Masakado rebellion, a conflict that killed thousands of soldiers and civilians whose remains were never properly recovered or honored. Masakado's own spirit became one of the most persistent and feared onryo in Japanese history. The stone marking his burial site in central Tokyo is still maintained as a shrine today. It has been moved twice. Both times, the people responsible reported significant misfortune shortly afterward and returned it. The last time was in the 1970s during construction of a government building. The construction stopped. The stone went back. This is the behavior of people who take something seriously, not as metaphor, as operational fact. Strix. The Strix is Roman, and she is old enough that Horace wrote about her. Ovid described her in detail, and Pliny the Elder included her in his natural history as a real animal requiring real countermeasures. She takes the form of an owl and visits infants at night, draining their blood and vitality across successive visits. The child is not found dead. It is found diminished, quieter, less present, eating less, responding less, drifting toward an absence that has no single cause and no single moment of onset. What the Strix represents is the death that arrives gradually and without declaration, the kind that cannot be attributed, cannot be prosecuted, cannot be reversed by any single correct action. The Romans treated it as a medical diagnosis as much as a supernatural threat. There were herbs, doorway treatments, specific threshold rituals for houses where infants slept. The Strix is the creature that explains why children sometimes simply fade. In Italian, strega still means witch. The word has been in continuous use with consistent meaning since the Roman Republic. Whatever the Strix was describing, sudden infant death, wasting illness, the particular grief of losing a child to something that leaves no evidence, it has been present long enough to need a name in every language that came after Latin. 10 creatures, Norse sagas and Chinese labor records and Romanian village inquests and Balinese spiritual practice and Roman medical literature. Separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years and no shared communication whatsoever. And the same logic appears in all of them. Die badly, in violence, in isolation, far from home, unmourned, or with something important unresolved, and you come back. The burial was not sentiment. It was protocol. It was the specific set of actions required to ensure the dead stayed where you put them. What differs across these traditions is not the logic. It's the paperwork. The Norse needed the body burned and the ashes scattered at sea. The Chinese needed the corpse home in the ancestral ground. The Romanians needed a bishop's written absolution placed in the coffin. The medieval French needed the wrong acknowledged by the right authority. All of them understood the same thing. The dead have requirements. Ignore the requirements, and the dead make the problem yours. We still hold funerals. We still repatriate remains. We still conduct official inquests and formal acknowledgments of historical wrongs. We have simply stopped explaining why those things matter in terms of what happens if you don't do them. The creatures knew. They were the explanation.